Reading Land, the Pitfalls of Permaculture and How to Avoid Them. And really, I need to start this off with a bit of a confession. I am not a permaculturist. I was trained in a slightly different methodology from a different lineage. And I really appreciate permaculture, really love permaculture, appreciate the movement. As someone who wasn't directly trained in it, I think I have a unique ability to spot different weak links and different shortcomings that we can help improve to really have a beneficial impact on the landscape. And so, as Ben mentioned, I learned from Sepp Holzer, who is a rebel farmer. And now some of you might be saying, but wait, the book is called Sepp Holzer's Permaculture. And really, in actuality, Sepp came across these ideas on his own by working and practicing and learning from nature, reading the book of nature. And then later on, as his farm got really developed, really beautiful, he had a lot of people come to him and ask him to call his work permaculture. They said, "You're the best example of permaculture in Europe. Please call your work permaculture." And so he read a bit about it, read into the ethics and thought, yeah, that sounds good. And so he went forward with that, a decision he would later regret, and he would not utter the word permaculture for a couple of years on end and then kind of soften back up to it. But there's this foundational different approach in the way that Sepp goes about things, the way that I learned to go about things, and a strictly permaculture perspective, as you might learn from the designer's manual or PC. What Sepp does is really firmly rooted in learning from nature, connecting to nature first and foremost, and letting that guide all of your decisions. It's really this participation and interaction and intuitive manifestation that happens with the living forces all around us. And so he created this beautiful farm called the Krameterhof, a network of 72 interconnected ponds and water bodies. It produces all of its food, medicine, fire, fodder, everything you really need for a healthy, happy life. And this is on a place that was thought to be possible for none of this. It's high in the Austrian Alps, in the coldest part of Austria, what they call the Siberia of Austria. And it's a place where you're only supposed to be able to do a little bit of dairy cow, pine monoculture, or maybe some grains, yet he has this fully functioning oasis. And he really developed this in this process of learning from and working with the landscape, doing something happens, learning from those results, and slowly moving forward. He's often said that he would have never imagined having so many water bodies on the top of a mountain like he does now, but he just did it bit by bit, developing over time and learning from each action that he took. And so by this process of reading the landscape, you can begin to see not just what the landscape is, but what it could be or what it may have been in the past. And so this is a project Tamara in Portugal. This is a place that gets nearly no precipitation for most of the year. And this community was running out of water, didn't have enough water for agriculture, and now are water self-sufficient and actually drinking the water that's being recharged by this water retention landscape. Now, this is done only with natural materials, only with the resources freely available from nature. He saw an opportunity where a road had been drying out this landscape, and to turn that road into a dam to then create this water body, catch the seasonal moisture, feed it back into the earth. It's a really important part about these projects that often gets missed is you're not just holding the water body, the water in the water body itself, you're holding it in the surrounding landscape. And this is only done if you work in the acupuncture points within the landscape. So nothing pisses me off more than seeing these plastic liner, rubber liner ponds done by permaculturists that are basically tanks in the ground. They have no connectivity to the hydrology. They have no beneficial impact on the watershed. What we need to do instead is find the natural clay layers, find the natural impermeable layers, use that clay to build earthen dams, which hold the water only on the downhill side. So they're allowing that water to be recharged into the landscape uphill, surrounding the dam, making these very green zones that you see by the water body. Now, this is one of his most impressive projects in Spain, where it's 45 degrees Celsius, hot blowing winds for 3 months in the summer. People said there's no way you can create water bodies here, but because he could read the landscape, because he could read the earthen materials, he knew how to make it happen. And so it really goes back to, first and foremost, learning from nature, letting nature be your guide and teacher. I find permaculture talks about this a lot, but they don't really prepare you with the skills to do so. They talk about observing, but not what to observe or how to observe it. And so through time, your plans should be changing over time as you learn from the landscape. Now, another mentor of mine, Rajendra Singh, very similar story. Now here, he was actually a doctor who was trying to treat night blindness in the elderly people remaining in the village. One of the elders showed him a different way to help the community, that this community, what they were most lacking was water. And if they wanted to help the community, they actually needed to work for the water. And so he taught Rajendra the traditional way of managing water on this landscape. In this area in India, they actually had a rich cultural history of water management, of creating these johads, small earthen ponds built with earthen materials that hold the seasonal water and let it recharge into the ground. And so as a doctor, when he started this work, he was laughed at, he was ridiculed. It's far below a doctor to be digging in the earth. Yet eventually people from the community started to help, and before the seasonal monsoons, this first johad was completed. Now, of course, they had the water in the johad, but what they found is then in the next dry season, the wells which had gone dry were now full of water. So actually creating that johad had recharged the aquifer that they were dependent on in the drier times. And so it's really important that we start to feed water back into the earth in all these different ways. We've drained the water out of the earth, away from the earth. When we start to recharge it, we can achieve some really incredible results. And again, this is primarily done by reading the landscape, by searching for different geological layers, by reading the vegetation layers to understand what is possible. And so in a lot of these areas, they're actually searching for vertically fractured geology, so that that water can infiltrate into the ground and it gets away from the sun. So they're oftentimes making these water bodies that infiltrate as quickly as possible. Now, how can they find that vertical fracturing within the geology? These are super poor communities. They're not going through with big excavators and digging everything up. They can read it in the trees within the landscape, because in certain areas, you're going to find the same trees of the same age are twice as big and twice as strong. And that's often where that vertical fracturing within the geology allows the tree to grow its roots deep and to tap into that water table. So by reading the trees, by reading the vegetation, they could understand where to put these johads that would then later recharge their water table. And what I really love about Rajendra's work is, in addition to reading the landscape, learning from the landscape, he also really engaged with learning from the people, with understanding what their concerns were, what their needs were. These are some of the harshest places in the world, 9 inches of precipitation in a desert most of the year. And these communities were really struggling. But oftentimes these communities had most of the resources they needed to actually be able to solve that issue, but they needed to be led to that solution. And so they started these water congresses, where individuals from every family would have one family member attend these water congresses. They'd discuss the issues, what resources they had, and how they could go about seeking a solution. And so this is one of those villages. This was a village where all the young people had fled. There was no future in this village. They drilled 27 wells, all of which were dry. In this village, they thought they were going to have to leave. Now, for less cost than those 27 wells, they built this one water body that enabled that community to go from 9 hectares of agriculture to 650 hectares of agriculture. They paid for the cost of the dam 4 times over the first year in its agricultural productivity. Now, really important, this isn't just taking one simple technique and applying it everywhere, but it's looking for the narrow points, the acupuncture points, where our impact can have a really beneficial impact on the landscape, and then pursuing that with the community support. And so this causes this whole cascade in these regions. In these areas, female children weren't going to school because they were being forced to carry water all day, every day. Now in these regions, female children are back to school, learning to read and write because they don't have to water every day. And so it creates these ripple effects throughout the whole village when you create this kind of work. And so over time, this project achieved some really incredible results. They've lowered the temperature 2 degrees Celsius in this region. They've lifted the water table 5 meters in some areas. They've brought water back to 250,000 wells, and they revived 7 rivers to perennial flow. Now, this was done over a period of 35 years by community-led initiatives, community-driven, decentralized water management. And so for me, it's really important. This is a quote that is very near to my heart from Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. And it's that knowing is not enough, we must apply. Willing is not enough, we must do. And for me, that's really salient and really important, because if we want a better world, knowing how to make it a better world and wanting it to be so is never going to get us there. It's about applying that knowledge and about enacting that willpower in order to be able to. Now, another quote from Albert Einstein that I think speaks to the same thing is, in theory, theory and practice are the same. In practice, they are not. And anyone that's a practitioner of anything, whether it's an instrument, an art, a skill, a trade, you know that the bulk of your experience, the bulk of your value comes from the practice, not the theory. And so this is, I think, one of the real weak links of permaculture that I hope that with my input, you all can help improve and move forward. A phrase that Sepp uses often is theory cripples. Now, he uses this to describe all sorts of people that are shackled by their own doctrine. And so it's really important with both of these people that I learned from, it wasn't theory first that they then tried to put into practice. It was practice first. And oftentimes they still don't really have theories about it. They just practice it, because practicing is what delivers the results. And so I think this is one of the foundational differences between the way I learned and permaculture. Permaculture was in theory first. It came up with different theories and rationale of how to do things. And now everyone's trying to put those theories into practice. Sometimes it's best to practice first and then let the practice inform your theories rather than vice versa. So a way that I describe a lot of what we do, I've heard it said that permaculture is a design science. I think that what this is more of an awareness art. There's not a recipe book to it. There's not a simple formula that you can follow. You have to actually be aware of, in connection to, and in relationship with the landscapes that you're working for. And it's something that's going to be different from person to person, from place to place, much more loose and interpretive, like an art versus a science. And so I heard it said once by a permaculture designer that contours are the language of the landscape. And my jaw just dropped. I actually got really fearful for the future when I heard that, because contours are absolutely not the landscape of the language of the landscape. The language of the landscape is in the sounds, in the sights, in the tastes, the smells, the touches, the experiences that you have within that landscape. It's a language much older than words. Now, what are contours? Contours are a model. They're a representation that is inaccurate by nature, and that is a very small bit of information. If you think, when we experience a landscape, we're getting information about that landscape constantly through all of our 5 senses. When we're working from a contour map, all we have is the most basic representation, which is going to be incomplete even with the highest resolution models, and is going to be only a tiny little sliver of information about that landscape. So I think only for those truly disconnected from nature are contours the language of the landscape. It is in those sounds, those sights, those smells. So many times on properties, the things that I experience, the things that I observe, I would have never found from a map. I can't tell you how many times I've done one-day consults and been told that I spent more time on site than a permaculture designer did that did a master site plan for that site. Now, when that kind of design is done on the drafting board, it's always going to be out of touch with the landscape. You can't smell the different smells as you move through different areas of humidity in the earth. You can't taste the differences in soils. You can't see where the wildlife are going. You can't see the trails of the animals. You're going to miss so much critical information about that landscape. And so I want to share with you some examples of what I call disconnected design. Design that's not first looking to how to connect with that landscape, but is really taking a more controlled Western engineered approach. So one of these projects, it was a north-facing slope in Slovenia. A beautiful property, beautiful views, mature orchards, a whole terrace system that was already in place. You could tell it was really cultivated in the traditional European agriculture, which was quite ecological in a lot of different ways. Now, on this landscape previous to me, they had a big fancy permaculture designer come out. They paid that permaculture designer, I don't know if it was $10,000 or $20,000. The permaculture designer got on the site, spent an hour or two there, and told them they should sell it. Told them that it wasn't worth it. It wasn't valuable because it was this north-facing slope. Now, I think this is one of the ways you can start to see how theory cripples, because in northern latitudes, we think, oh, south-facing slope is going to be our best microclimate. And we don't understand that every aspect has its own benefits, has its own advantages. It's not that just south-facing slopes should be cultivated or permaculture should be done on. North-facing slopes have their own advantages, have their own competitive advantages over south-facing slopes that might not have those. And so when you look at like Sepp's new farm, for example, it's a north-facing slope in Austria, exactly what you'd think you wouldn't want. But in this part of Austria, it's very dry. So he actually prefers a north-facing slope to be able to hold the water much better. Now, this property is a beautiful example because it was sold for very cheap because the farmer thought it was worthless. They couldn't get a yield off of it with the corn, and they were trying, but yet he knew that with a little bit of work, it could be transitioned to something incredible. And now you go there and there's food falling on the ground everywhere. This apple tree is falling over with its own weight. It's so productive. It has a grape just loaded with grapes pulling it to the ground as well. And this is done with no impact by using the natural resources of the landscape. Now, this is a tree grown with very little effort on a farm that the farmer sold because he couldn't get a crop off of it. He couldn't get a yield off of it. Now, another example, a food forest in Wisconsin. Similarly, this one had a $20,000 price tag. Permaculture designer comes in, does the master site plan, spec'd out this huge orchard, food forest, 14,000 trees. They planted them all out and they all died. Now, why did they all die? Well, it turns out it was limestone ledge 6 or 8 inches beneath the topsoil. So this designer never did a test slice, never understood the geology they were working with, and was making big recommendations with huge cost consequences without a basic understanding of that landscape, without taking the time to really learn from and connect to that landscape. Now, this is an earth stable we built using the earthen resources, using that cool temperature to keep animals cooler in the summer, warmer in the winter. All of these limestone blocks came out of this landscape. It is just limestone ledge. It's like a limestone quarry. Yet because that designer didn't take the time to connect to and learn from that landscape, they recommended this project that ended up being a huge failure. So if I can implore you to do one thing, dig test slices, get a gateway into the earth, understand the earthen resources that you're dealing with. This is a huge pivotal part of any project, in my opinion. This is something I do at the first part of the site consult, because without this information, we're just making guesses. You would be astonished by how many permaculture designs are done without ever making a test slice. And to me, if a permaculture design was done without test slices, that permaculture design, you can basically just throw it away. It has no real value in terms of connection to and relationship with that landscape. And we want to not only be doing test slices, but doing test slices in these potential acupuncture points within the landscape, in the areas where the plants, where the smells are telling us that we might be able to gather and store water. And then in these areas, we can probe into the ground, we can start to understand the geological layers. And then, and only then, can we really understand whether earthworks are a great idea or not. And so this is really important. When you're doing earthworks, it's a lot easier to cause damage than to do something good. And yes, it's something that we should be doing towards the beginning of projects, but we should really understand what we're doing. We shouldn't just go in and create a mess because we want to do something or because these theories seem to make sense. We have to actually practice. We have to actually learn from that specific landscape. And you'll be amazed at what you find when you start doing test slices. The underground reservoirs of water you'll find, the earthen resources you'll find, the different ways that water is moving through the landscape that you'll learn about. You can learn so much by making these narrow little test slices into the earth. And so let's talk about the notorious SWALE, the permaculture swale. I think this is one of the most over-applied techniques in permaculture. I have been designing hundreds, if not thousands of properties. I have yet to find a property where I think a swale is a good solution for that landscape and that person. Now, that's not to say that it doesn't exist. I'm sure somewhere out there in the world it does exist, but I have yet to find it. And so I hope this is kind of a light bulb moment for some of you. I think the swale is this easy concept to understand. It's great in theory, but when you put it into practice, there's all these different issues. Where do you access? How do you harvest? As soon as this landscape changes hands, are they just going to bulldoze the swales because they don't understand what it is or how to work with it? And I've seen so many permaculture swales that either don't achieve anything substantially positive or are actually destructive and degradative in different ways. So an example of this, a story from Sep in Ecuador. He was working on a permaculture project down there, and they had made this big, great swale to put all of their roof water off of this hotel into this swale. Now, in theory, that's a great idea. Why? You'll see, I want you guys to be balancing your water budget. We should all strive to balance our water budget. But you have to also understand where you are and observe and interact with that landscape. So he was watching these huge rains come down and flow into this swale and instantly go into the ground, never pooling up, never overflowing. And he looked at this and he said, hey, guys, if you don't fix this, you're going to have a huge landslide. This water is all going in too fast. And now what they had done is they had exposed a more permeable subsoil that they had then hypercharged with water on a steep slope. Sep left, they didn't follow his recommendations. 2 years later, huge landslide, big lawsuit, huge issues. And so this is something that's really possible. That's why it's so important to understand the geology, the layers, the types of material you're working with. There's no one solution or one approach that you can just blindly apply on all landscapes. In fact, it works almost directly the opposite. Another really good story of this from Jared Diamond's book, Collapse. One European agriculture advisor was horrified to notice that a New Guinean sweet potato garden on a steep slope in a wet area had vertical drainage ditches running straight down the slope. That sounds like a permaculturist to me. He convinced the villagers to correct their awful mistake, and instead of putting in drains running horizontally along contours, or instead to put drains in running horizontally along contours according to good European practices. Awed by him, the villagers reoriented their drains, with the result that the water built up behind the drains, and in the next heavy rains, a landslide carried the entire garden down to the slope and the river below. So this is really important that we have to understand where we are climatically. We have to understand where we are from a soil standpoint, and that no one solution fits everywhere. We need a custom solution to the places we're working. Now, you know, this is the kind of thing that in theory, of course, you want to hold that water on the landscape. You want as much water and as much fertility, But you got to have all of the factors. If this is a region with high rainfalls, if this is a region with loose soils, or where the excess rain is not helpful or even decorative, then it doesn't make sense to do this kind of technique. Similarly, places I see them put in, you're creating anaerobic soil conditions because of how long they do hold water. So it's really important to really understand where you're working. This is a great little guide made by Ben. He'll be speaking tomorrow from Whole Systems Design of should I swale that, and when or when not you might swale. So I think there's this epidemic within permaculture that, there's the saying, when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Well, the swale is this easy to understand concept that can be applied broadly just by looking at the contour map. You can see where to put your swales in. And so everyone's going around banging in their swales, mostly in places where they don't really make sense, mostly in ways that they don't really deliver meaningful results over time. And so it's really important to stay away from that kind of thinking. We're so easily drawn to the new shiny thing, and we want to just apply the new shiny thing, but it's not that easy. And so I want to highlight some areas where I think permaculture tends to mislead people. One is in designers versus practitioners. In permaculture, it's all about the design, the permaculture design course. We want to have tons and hundreds, thousands, millions of permaculture designers. Yet there's no practitioners. Most designers come in and they give your fancy piece of paper to you, and then they say, good luck finding someone to implement that, because there's no one out there that actually understands how to do the work. And I think this is kind of in the lineage of it coming from theory. The path for permaculturists is to become a designer and to teach others permaculture design, but never in that lineage is there really a stout practitioner. And so you have these people that are designers, not practitioners, teaching other people. And so you have just a bunch of people that really mean well, but don't know what to do or how to do it. And in actuality, we should have thousands of practitioners for every one designer. The design is super easy. It's the practice that's difficult. And in actuality, it's probably the opposite. There's got to be thousands of designers for every one practitioner out there. So how do we really start to rebuild this lineage from a place of practitionership? Another things where I think permaculture really tends to mislead people is with these silver bullets, with these shiny things. So on the screen now is hugelkultur. Probably if most of you guys have heard about sepulcher, you've heard about hugelkultur. And it's sold as this silver bullet that's going to solve all of your garden woes. On Sep's new farm, there is one hugelkultur. It's barely involved. And in his overall approach, it is a very small piece of the puzzle. It's a waste management system. If you have a bunch of woody waste, why would you burn that when you could turn it into soil? Oftentimes, these hugelkulturs are then taken apart for the soil later on and spread into terraces or different types of growing systems. So for a lot of you, this will be the only thing you heard about Sepp Holzer, but in actuality, it's just a tiny little piece of what he's doing. And the claims have been way overgrown. I've heard that, once you put in a hugelkultur, you never need to water it. That absolutely depends on your climate. There's all these different factors that are in play there. So another thing like this must have been thought of by someone who had never practiced at least one of these techniques, or probably both, the hugel swale. Now, this is something that makes a ton of sense in theory, but in practice, this really doesn't hold up, because hugelkulturs, as that woody debris breaks down, for one, the actual mound settles over time, and then two, you have all of these ways for water to find a way through. Water has such a tiny head, and with even a little bit of pressure, it can work its way along any little channel that it can find. So a system like this, it certainly is going to fail over time as that hugelkultur degrades. That berm of the swale becomes not a berm. Some part settles more than another. You have the water overflow now go to that low part and cause a big erosion gully or a failure of the system. Now, it might fail even before that, with the water finding its way to that woody feature and then working through it so that you actually have a drain going through your swale where you didn't intend it. Additionally, hugelkulturs are not tree growing systems. They settle too much to be able to support the lattice of a tree. Swales are typically entirely tree growing systems. And so it's one of these things where, in theory, it seems like a great idea. In practice, it usually doesn't hold up so well. Some other things where I see time and time again, these ideals of permaculture lead people away from the solution that's actually best for their landscape. Storing water high on the landscape versus storing water like nature does. Now, of course, it's great to hold water high on the landscape, but very rarely do you have a suitable pond site high on the landscape. Why is this? Well, water is carrying, sorting, and settling different materials in different ways. As it gathers energy, it's gathering materials. As it loses energy, it's depositing those, but in a very deliberate way. And it's depositing its gravel, then it's sand, then it's silt, and then finally it's clay, only where that water gets flat. And so in the flatter, lower parts of the landscape is where water is going to have collected and stored clay from that landscape over time. And so in these areas where you see water naturally flowing and collecting, it has also done the work to concentrate the best materials from that landscape into that place. Can't tell you how many times working for people, they have me keep doing test slices up high on the landscape because they're following the permaculture idea that they want to store their water high on the landscape. And they don't understand that they're never going to be able to have a water body high on the landscape because none of the good materials are there. Now, there are exceptions and rare cases where this is possible, but most of the time that is not actually the case. And so you see that with Sepp's place, you see that with all of these different places. If you're really working with these acupuncture points in the landscape where nature is already collecting the resources you need, your actions can be very effective. Now, another thing where I think permaculture tends to mislead, slow and small solutions. If I had to wrap up Sepp's mentality, it would be much more of a go big or go home. I think we're in this space now where things are so broken, things are becoming so unstable that we have to act in a really deliberate manner and we have to take big actions. When the damage is done with an excavator, it's really hard to repair it with a shovel. And in fact, we should be using some of this last fossil fuel resource we have in order to set up our hydrology better for future generations. And so this is Sepp's vision for the global water retention of the planet. And with these kind of strategies, you start to see how every place could be green, every place could be productive. If we only go with small, slow solutions, we're never going to get there. What we really need is this punctuated equilibrium, much like nature does. Now, another thing that I really hope to instill in all of you guys is this concept of the master site plan. The master site plan, I find in its most helpful way, it's maybe a guess at what could be possible. And in its least helpful way, it's actually misleading because people get that vision in their heads and it should not look like you intended 10 years later. You should be learning from the landscape. You should be changing as you go. And so this idea that we're the commander, we're the controller, and we know everything that's going to happen over the next 10 years to develop this 10-year plan, it's just kind of hogwash, in my opinion. I tell people, even for the first part of the plan, if what we implement looks exactly like what we designed, we have screwed up because we should be changing our design, changing our plan based on what we're finding as we're doing it. If we're digging into a certain area and it's getting sandier and another area is getting clayier, we might expand the pond in one direction versus the other. And so what Sepp does is much more of an intuitive manifestation. It's really doing something happens, and then working with that result. I've seen Sepp draw once. I've worked with Sepp for years and years on different projects all over the place. The one time I saw him draw was when a translator was trying to draw out what he was speaking about, and he kind of scratched out something really quick, but he doesn't even do plans. He just sees in his mind's eye how that landscape could respond to different actions. And so for me, it's really important. Don't do your designs on a map. Don't do your designs at a desk. Do your designs on the landscape in your mind's eye. There are going to be all these details and essential elements that you miss if you're doing your designs at the desk. So this is all gearing up towards this general mentality that people have, one of engineered domination versus a symbiotic relationship. Now, in this engineered domination, we can control it. And so our human impulse is really like that. In this symbiotic relationship, we need to give up a lot of control. We give up a lot of responsibility, we give up a lot of work, but we give up some control as well in the process. And this comes from a root cause that I think is much deeper. It's actually the delusion of human as commander-in-chief. I really like what Ernst Gosch says, where he says, I do not believe in commander-in-chief. I do not believe that humans are the center of the living world and should choose what happens and control everything. We are just part of this ecosystem. And so when we look at the impact of this worldview, this is colonization. This is the loss of all of the cultures around the world, all the traditional heritage, the language. We have lost so much through this process of convincing people that they're not good enough, that they should extract their own wealth, their own time, energy, their landscape's wealth for the betterment of someone else. And if you look, in some places, colonization is marked by a geological event. In Australia, they flogged the landscape so hard that then with the heavy rains, the crappy soil from the highlands actually washed into the lowlands because they grazed it so hard during a drought. They destroyed all the vegetation. The heavy rains came that it actually buried the good soil in a layer of crappier soil above that. So it's really traumatic, the effects that this colonization has had on ourselves and on our landscape. And over the last 10,000 years, this human activity of colonization has desertified 1/3 of Earth's land. 1/3 of all of the land on the planet has been desertified in just that short period of time. And so what this has done is it's really changed the water flow over time of that landscape. Now that water flow is happening all at once, leading to erosion, flood, risk, cost, insurance, finance to cover all of that. But then because you've designed the flood, you've also designed the drought with that set of erosion, risk, cost, insurance, finance, and it's making this situation that's not viable. Not only that, we have now this dry earth heating up more and more, re-radiating that heat. And in the previous situation, there was some runoff, but a lot more infiltrated and moved slowly through that landscape so that there was water flow consistently throughout the year and transpiration, photosynthesis happening, cooling the air 590 calories per gram of water transpired all throughout the year, making this much more balanced biome and climate that we knew. And this is what that looks like on the land. This is Mannahatta, New York City, under indigenous stewardship and under colonial stewardship. In indigenous stewardship, everything had a role, everything had spirit, everything had purpose. In the colonial management, everything has energy to be exploited. And you can see very clearly in this image, which would you rather live in? And so we've taken this full water cycle. I really implore you guys to check out the whole video here. It's on the community at Water Stories. But it's this balanced cycling of water where the trees, the vegetation play an important role in precipitating the rain and producing those precipitation nuclei that cause the rain. And then the temperature and pressure difference of that water as it condenses and changes phases causes a biotic pump pulling in more humid air from the coast. You get this infiltration into the landscape from cool shaded soils, and you get the natural smooth cycling of water throughout the year. What we've created through colonization is what I call the watershed death spiral, where we've cleared the forests, the rains when they come run off, leading to flooding, then followed by drought. The bare, hot landscapes heat up. Those high pressure heat domes reject the incoming humidity until it becomes so great that it overwhelms for these bigger, more powerful, more intense storms than before, with longer periods of drought in between, and then this horrible death spiral of flood, drought, and fire. And so this is leaving our communities in crisis. Really, around the world, we see it year after year. It seems to be ever more pervasive, intensive, and common. And this is all part of humanity's legacy, but we can also reverse it, and we can reverse it with some really simple means. So what do we want to do instead? Let's really take some time to dive into this. The first thing is decolonize your mind. People might have some friction to this, but the easiest way to decolonize your mind is to have love and respect for water and nature. If you can every day find a little bit more love and respect for water and a little bit more love and respect for nature, you will undo these effects that colonization has had on yourself. Another really important piece is read your landscape. Reading your landscape is so important. We are hardwired to read the landscape in a really deep and meaningful way, but we're losing that ability. We're not practicing it. We're losing that language. And so take the time to get out on your landscape, to read it, to understand it, to engage with it. In the course we do, the whole first module is just focused on reading the landscape, because to me, that is the most important thing to doing real beneficial permaculture earthworks. Another really important thing is practice. The best education is observation and participation. Don't let yourself get wrapped up into analysis paralysis. Do something and then you'll learn something. Do something and then something will change. It's better to move in the wrong direction than to not move at all, because then you're going to learn, and through that feedback, you're going to learn what the right direction is. So it's really important to engage your hands. You can tell someone's experience, someone's real knowledge by their hands. Do they have art that's, to me, a lot of on the ground experience, but this experience that's cast into your hands is permanently there. That's our real wealth, our real assets in this world. And so take the time, get out on the landscape, get your feet on the ground, get yourself engaging and learning from that landscape. It's super important to actually moving forward in a positive direction. Now, another thing is plant the rain, then plant the plants. I see a lot of times where people get excited about the plants, they understand that part the best, and it's the easiest, and so they go about planting the whole project, but they haven't taken the time to set that landscape up to receive the rain. They haven't planted the rain beforehand. And so I think absolutely have that energy to get out there and plant stuff immediately, but do it in a test nursery. Do it in a test garden where you're just trying a little bit of everything to see who survives, who thrives, who needs what in order to survive and thrive, while you learn how to plant the rain in your landscape. Now, in some landscapes, that's going to be in place already. In others, you're going to need to make interventions in order to do that. So a great example of this, a project in Australia, Desert or Rainforest, is a film we have about this project, where they created water retention features. They stored the seasonal water in the earth. They recirculated that in a misting system to increase the humidity in this valley. And they turned a drying, dying, desertifying valley into a rainforest in a climate where there was not previously rainforest. And so to me, this is a really amazing example of what's possible when we plant the rain first. Now, a really other important thing is to transform our watersheds into water catchments. We have taken our watersheds and we have made them drain all of the water away as quick as possible. We're prioritizing downstream flow in every way, from our water rights to our infrastructure to our engineering of buildings. And what we need to do is find ways to take these areas that are shedding water and instead make them catch water, or collect the water that's shedding off of certain landscapes and infiltrate it in others. And so we really need to increase recharge and decrease discharge. There's this really scary thing going on right now where everyone's over extracting their groundwater. They're pulling out more than we're putting in, And we all know what happens when we do that to our bank account. We get broke, we fall into this cycle of debt, and it's very hard to get out. So before we get into that vicious cycle of debt, we need to start focusing on putting more water into the earth than we're taking out in our wells. And when you do this, there's some really incredible things possible. This is what was done in this project with Rajendra, another film of ours, Reviving Rivers, where they literally revived 7 rivers from this work, some of which one was dry for 40 years, and now it has perennial flow. So by just storing these seasonal rains with earthen water bodies in the acupuncture points of the earth, we can achieve these really incredible results. It's really about reviving the water cycle, finding the ways to feed the water back into the earth, to reprime that biological pump, that biotic pump that moves water through Earth's continents. So a really important piece that we all can do is balance your water budget. Now, most of us live in a home, a lot of us use roads. We're making all of these areas that used to be able to infiltrate that water, and we're forcing that water to run off. So what we can each do first, we're not even being beneficial yet, but just neutral, is find ways to infiltrate all of that water back into the earth. So this is a project, a home, a wood shop, pretty big buildings causing a lot of runoff, yet we can store all that runoff in this nice water body that then becomes a beautiful habitat feature, a beautiful swimming feature for the people living there. And so it's helping the environment, but it's also helping ourselves achieve a higher quality of life. So this is another example of that in a project in Australia where they had tried to do a pond previously high on the landscape, as permaculture tells you, yet high on the landscape was just ridge gravel. We had to go low on the landscape to find the right materials to store that water. And now right after we finished this, they had a horrific 2-year drought, and this farmer would have been dust without the water work that we had done. But because we stored the water, how nature did at the bottom of that property where it had been collecting and concentrating the clay, and then with the terrace systems helping infiltrate even more water, they were able to not only survive, but produce more than they ever had before, even in this horrific drought when everyone was selling off their cattle and many even having to sell their land. Now, a similar situation, this was a landscape that burned. It was so dehydrated that it burned, yet there were these simple ways to make these infiltration features. It gets so much water when it rains, but it all runs away. Now, this isn't an area where people say it's impossible to make a pond that doesn't leak. And in fact, on 99% of this property, it was impossible to create a pond that didn't leak. But there's all these micro geological areas within projects. I don't even look at the soils maps before I go places anymore because the resolution is not fine enough. I've found over time that it's more misleading than helpful to look at these different USGS soil maps, for example, because on this property, even though 99% of it didn't have the right soil, this place had the perfect soil. And I would have never seen this from a map. It didn't look that much different from a contour perspective, yet the vegetation was markedly different. There was a very clear difference in this place. And so that vegetative cue told me to dig a test slice there, and we found this beautiful clay to make this water body so that now this area is much better set up for the next time a fire does come. Now, for those of you living in fire areas, I really implore you to check out Peter and Kate Marshall, Terra Preta Farms. They have an area where they've implemented this for a very long time. They've implemented decentralized water retention. They took this old gold mine and totally restored it. And when they had the horrific fires in Australia, it burned around them for 2 months, and they were the only ones that didn't burn. They were taking crown fires to ground fires through their forestry management, through their soil management, and through their water management. And so for those of us living in fire zones, this is really important. Our landscapes don't have to burn. It's from our poor previous stewardship, our mismanagement of those resources that they're burning today, yet the solutions are all within our hands. And it's really this idea of, do we want to be promoting fungi on our landscape or fire? We really can have one of the two in order to handle all of the woody waste that these forests are producing. So another big thing is to make interventions that last. I like to make earthworks that are going to last until the next ice age. Now, this was done in 11 days with a small team of people. And this is a feature that will last for many generations, that generations of bears and turtles and geese are going to be benefiting from. Another important thing is to learn and use microclimates. There's this concept in cold places of a crater garden, to make a sheltered, sunken garden, and that you can store and trap the sun's energy in. In these stones, they're set into the earth like passive solar homes where the southern face is exposed and the rest is covered in earth. It heats up and charges the earth. And in this area, place that the last snow is in June and the first snow is in August, we were able to plant in February and March because the sun had warmed up the earth just around the stones, where to the point where the earth was no longer frozen. Now, this is another example of that, where we're also helping balance that water budget, taking the water running off of the house and feeding it into the earth. Now, you can feel an immense humidity difference right as soon as you walk into this crater garden. It's such a tremendous difference. It's also really important to learn and use the natural resources. So many times I've been in places where people say ponds aren't possible, you need liners, you need to import clay. And yes, it's not possible anywhere on that landscape, but within certain areas of that landscape, it's very possible. Another example where, again, a landscape told me that water should be concentrating and collecting in this area, both from the shape of the land, by the vegetation. And it turns out it was actually a spring in that area that was previously tapped and drain tiled away. And in this area, again, this is karst topography. You shouldn't be able to build a pond here, but we had the earthen resources we needed to realign the clay, shuffle around the rocks, and create this beautiful water body. Now, it's really important to use the resources that you have. I see all the time people bringing in different resources. A lot of times you can find the resources that you need directly on site, so long as you're a little bit careful and creative about managing them as you work through the project. Another great example of this is a small little terrace that Sepp created through a mature forest, where he saw all these seeds rolling down the steep hill and none of them germinating. He cut in a little terrace just to give them spots to germinate. And now he has $1,000 of nursery stock that grows itself on this terrace that he can continually come and harvest, use in different areas, or sell, that he does no direct work for, other than having created the terrace because he saw the natural resource that was available. Similarly, this is a spring terrace where Sepp actually created a spring where there wasn't one before. Now, you would never find this from a contour map. He only found this through digging in the landscape, through testing, finding different geological features. He found this area that he thought he might be able to collect and harvest water over time. And now that produces 5 liters per minute all throughout the year. And this property is a great testament to that, where the farmer before sold it because they thought it was worthless. Now you go there and there's literally food falling on the ground year round. Now, this is the neighbor's property, pine monoculture, and this is Sepp's property. And you can instantly, with your eyes, see the huge amount of diversity that's going to exist on this landscape versus the previous one. So we really have all of these resources available. We have Mother Nature just dying for us to work with her. And when we start working with nature, we're putting into play this perpetual motion machine. And so we have a lot of scary environmental crises at our doorstep, but I think they all can be solved with love and respect for water and nature. You look at something like climate change, global warming. It's actually 70 to 95% of the heat dynamics on Earth that are driven by the water cycle. Now, in our myopic science, we've kind of set that aside from the equation, but it's actually the easiest way that we can have a direct impact on the most severe effects of climate change. So for people who want to learn more, this is my business, Elemental Ecosystems, my contracting company. We go around helping people implement this kind of work on their own landscapes. But then this is what I'd really like you all to check out, waterstories.com, where I've learned that I could spend the rest of my life working myself into an early grave and have no meaningful difference, that this needs to be decentralized, that this needs to be the people's knowledge so that they can restore landscapes for themselves. And so this is exactly what we're aiming to do with Water Stories. We have animations, we have free films, all available to those who join the community, totally free to join. And then you're also joining a community of practitioners around the world that are really ready to help and support this change. We've had a really good adoption in our first year. We've reached people in 183 countries around the world already. And so it's really hope inspiring to see how many people are ready to move into this new water paradigm. And so we're going to have a course coming up. It's going to open on November 27th. We can only take so many students. This one will fill and we'll have to close. We'll open it, we'll keep it open till December 10th or until we fill all spots. And it starts on January 9th. And so this course is all centered around teaching others how to become a water restoration practitioner, how to enact this approach of a Sepp Holzer or a Rajendra Singh in order to bring water back to your landscape.
Zach, thank you so much for that. And we have a bunch of questions.
A lot of questions.
Yeah.
There's two that are related here, and they're both upvoted quite a bit. So one, how do you find acupuncture points? Like, what process do you use to find those acupuncture points? And then how do you find them in urban environments?
Oh, that latter one is a big can of worms. So the biggest thing for me is walk the property, walk it all, and then walk it all some more. So I will walk the boundaries. I will walk all of the water flows. And then what that landscape shows you during those walks, that's going to be the easiest way to locate those acupuncture points. So sometimes that's going to be seen by vegetation. Now, for example, you don't need to know the specific, you can know that willow likes water, sure. But in a lot of places I'm working, I don't know the plants. And so on my way to the site, I'm reading the plants and I'm seeing, okay, that plant likes it up high and dry. That plant likes it down in the ditch. Now, if I'm walking around on that landscape and I see a plant that likes it down in the ditch up on the ridge, I know there's water within that landscape because I've seen previously that that plant is dependent upon that water. So a lot of it is in reading the vegetation, reading the smells as you're walking through properties. That's hugely important for me. A lot of times you can smell springs or smell more humid areas within the ground before you actually find them. Similarly, the animal trails. The animals are going to show you a lot of places where they go to drink every day, where they're moving through. And so by following these animal trails, by walking the water flows, by walking the perimeters, and then also by really looking at where water is moving and concentrating. So ideally, you would walk a property when it's raining. I think one of the best ways is to go outside when it's raining. We all want to be inside and nice and cozy, but put on a big jacket and go outside in the rain. That's going to teach you a lot about these acupuncture points. But also you can see from the signs that water leaves behind, you can read previous water flow on that landscape. So much like an animal leaves a track as it crosses through grasses, so does water as it flows. And so you can see what the springtime water flow is like, even if you're in the subsequent fall, so long as you start to learn and read those subtle trails and tracks of water.
Yeah. I wanted to recommend a book for anybody, because as you started your presentation, Zach, I was like, wow, this reminds me a lot about a book that I read by a guy named Tristan Gooley called The Lost Art of Reading Nature's Signs. And that was, obviously I took a permaculture design course, and as Zach mentioned, like, it gives you a few tools, but not really the full toolkit for reading the landscape in the way that you can, Zach. But this book for me was just like mind-blowing. Like when you were talking about how you can look at the types of plants that are growing in the forest and start to see patterns, and it's like, oh, I have a feeling that there's a different soil type here because the plants are just a little bit different, like starting to to see those clues, notice those differences. Like it starts with walks, with observation, as well as just, a lot of lived experience as well, like an understanding about ecology, knowing the different kinds of trees, how to see different kinds of leaves. Like it takes time. And I'd highly recommend that book for anybody. It's 23.27 Canadian on Amazon for anybody who wants it.
Yeah, I definitely noted that. That I haven't checked that one out, but that sounds great. I'm always looking for more different ways into that viewport. And then as far as the urban landscape, I think a big piece of it really goes into digging up and through the history of that, the story of that watershed. So many of our urban landscapes are actually built in the areas that were floodplain, that were these rich waterways. Most cities in the United States were built in these areas that previously were beautiful, diverse wetlands.
Mm-hmm.
And so we can't necessarily just remove the whole city and restore it all to the way it was. And so I think in the urban context, we need to find different areas to infiltrate that water. We've dried up the valley. We can't rehydrate it or we're going to destroy all the infrastructure. So we need to find ways both up and downstream of that area where we've had a huge negative impact in order to create a positive impact. And so this might mean creating water bodies where they weren't before, up higher on the landscape in the headwaters, because we can't just go about displacing millions of people to restore the lowlands as it once was.
Yeah. No, yeah, that's another book recommendation. Eager Beaver. A big reason why we've settled in these low valleys is because over time, like beavers are a super huge keystone species that have really shaped the landscape in North America. Most beavers are now dead because we killed them all. But it's like they created these really nice flat low-lying ecosystems for us. And then obviously humans came in and it's like, oh, here's this nice flat spot by the river, great place to build a house and a settlement. And we've displaced the beavers, we've disrupted the watersheds, and now we're suffering the consequences. So if anybody who wants to learn more about that, Eager Beaver.
What's called Eager.
And to give a feel for, totally second that recommendation. And to give you guys a feeling for how severe it is, in both California and Australia, they have lost 95% of their wetlands in the last 100 years.
That's mind-boggling.
Yeah, really puts into perspective how quickly we are disrupting things and leaving things in a state of disrepair without having a full understanding of the consequences.
Yeah. This next question, and there's two, and there's somewhat related, is how deep does a test slice have to go? And in a similar vein, how do you decide where to place test slices and what smells indicate that there's water present?
3 questions in one.
So test slices are as deep as they need to be, which is an amorphous answer because the reality is it is different from place to place. I kind of consider 2 meters to be a minimum. Ideally, you're digging your test slice at least as deep as your potential water body is going to be. Once you start to get to 4, 5, 6 meters or more, you're starting to get into a very expensive earth moving endeavor. So unless if you're really looking at a very narrow dam for a huge water body, I usually stop my test slices around 5 meters or so, sometimes a little bit deeper than that. But it's what you're really looking for is you're looking for what are the geological layers? How is Earth moving through that landscape? Is there a layer that is more than 40% clay that I could use for the key of a dam? And is there an impermeable layer that I can tie that dam into? Either a clay layer that is watertight, a rock layer that is watertight. So in some landscapes, we'll find that all within the first couple of feet. In other landscapes, we'll dig down 20 feet looking for it. Once we get below that depth, it starts to be a question of, okay, well, even if we found something down there, could we work with it? And then oftentimes too, we're finding seams and veins of the earth, these water flows, seasonal springs and seeps, through the ground, through these permeable layers that we can then try and tap into. And that's really how we go about confirming these acupuncture points, confirming these natural veins of the landscape. And then as far as the smells, it can be a number of different things. Sometimes it's an anaerobic kind of sour, swampy smell. Sometimes it's the very sweet smell of hydrated earth. If you're walking through a dry landscape and you all of a sudden smell the same smells that you smell when rain is just starting to happen, that's a really good indicator. A lot of times the smells are going to be more poignant with more humidity. And so sometimes just more smell. It can even be the same smell, just a higher level of that smell. So it's one of the senses that I'm using to pick up on a wide range. I call it splatter vision, where you're looking for the motion rather than the specific things. And so I'm using that smell as a key to then investigate more. I'm not necessarily saying, oh, I smelled that, I know that this is X, Y, and Z, but it's more, okay, I smelled that, so I'm going to dig my hands into the soil a little bit. I'm going to stomp around this area. I'm going to kick around to further explore that sense.
Awesome. Well, while you're saying that, especially with the in reference to the veins, is there a non-intrusive way of surveying that is that can pick up on these water veins? I imagine like radio or anything in that matter.
There's some new stuff that people are working with, but nothing that I know of that's not still in the very experimental phase. I think the best and easiest way is by reading these vegetative layers. And as you get better at it, it is easier to see what's going on. But there's also in my opinion, there's no substitution for just digging a hole in the ground and seeing what's going on.
Absolutely.
You end up closing it right back up instantly. So the disturbance is quite small. The expense is maybe a bigger part of it, which again is not very much. If you're going to pay whatever, a couple $1,000s for permaculture design, pay $500 to do the test slices to understand if that's really relevant or not. So it's one of the things. I think there's all of the different coring options and boring options. They have too many limitations or are too expensive compared to just bringing in a small excavator or backhoe.
Yeah, and when you
or doing them by hand, a lot of times we do them by hand as well in places where equipment's not available.
Yeah, I'm curious, when was the first time you were able to hop into an excavator and be able to actually be confident in the work you're doing? And is there any methods of practice that you would recommend? I mean, there's a lot of people who are interested in getting into earthworks, but obviously it's pretty daunting. You could cause damage, and it's, you're getting into a big machine. What sort of training steps would you recommend other than hanging out with Sepp Holzer for a long duration of time?
Those were two very different points in time between first stepping in an excavator and first feeling confident in an excavator. What I did, I would not necessarily recommend. I would recommend part of what I did. So the first time I sat in an excavator, I rented one. I'd never driven one before. I had just taken a course with Sepp Holzer. I had ideas of what I might wanted to do, and I had them drop it off, and I sat in the cab and figured out what each lever did. I actually wouldn't recommend that. At some point you need to do that. But then what I actually ended up doing as well is starting to work with an experienced equipment operator in the area. He was a pond builder, but a liner pond builder. And we actually worked together for a number of my first projects where I learned a ton about excavation operation, material handling, things like that from working with him. And he learned a lot about how to do clay and earthen water bodies instead of liner bodies from me as a result. So it was a real win-win. both getting paid for the work, obviously. So if you can find some type of mentor to learn from, and then I am still constantly learning from other operators, just watching things unfold, watching what they're doing that's efficient, watching what they're doing that's not efficient, and constantly continuing to learn and advance that way by watching others. I'd say it really wasn't until, I don't know, the second or third year of really doing this work that I started to really feel comfortable, like I knew what was going on. And I'd say even more so, it was probably like 10 years before I felt like I was ready to start teaching others how to do this. And in some ways, I still feel like I don't have near enough experience, but I kind of started looking around the room and realizing, well, I have 100 times more experience than everyone else, so I guess I better start doing it.
Yeah.
But I think it's really important to have this beginner's mentality, to constantly be learning more and continuing. And so I think it's a constant journey. I think also you can learn a lot, both good and bad, by watching excavator videos on YouTube now. You know, what they do that ends up making the machine flip over. And then you can watch some really good operators on YouTube that have a camera right on the cab, and you just see how they so effortlessly and really efficiently move material around. There are also, there's CAT now makes like a training program. So it's basically computer software where you get the joysticks and you can practice the moves of the machine. Because at first, all you can do is make a mess, and that's really hard to do. And then you start to be somewhat useful, but you still can't make things clean and smooth at the end. Then you can finally make things nice, and it all becomes about increasing your efficiency and just how can you do things with as little movement as possible, with as little extra energy as possible.
Yeah, and it is so amazing to watch someone who's so experienced as an earth mover, to get like a swale perfectly to where it needs to be. It's beautiful.
Yeah.
What do you think would be the best approach to drought proofing a site when swales are not appropriate?
Again, it's going to ultimately come back to your soil and what kind of soil you have. As far as really drought proofing a site, I think that usually means implementing some water retention, whether those are perennial water bodies that are ponds, or whether they're vernal pools or infiltration basins. Terracing is also basically the times when I might otherwise do a swale, I will do a terrace, because it also gains access and usable cultivation area, in addition to the water recharge benefits. And then I think one thing that's really, really important is there are plenty of sites where earthworks should not be done, just period. More earth movement is going to make that site worse. And these are going to be situations usually where you have a more tight topsoil layer than a subsoil layer. You might have river cobble or a super sandy subsoil. And so in this case, you actually don't want to open the water up to that lower layer where it's just going to sink right down into the ground. You actually want to work on building up the biological quality of that soil. And that is the most effective thing, both with your vegetative systems and with your soil ecosystems. And that can be as effective as drought proofing a property as any amount of earthworking, and actually more effective in certain cases.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that makes sense. If you're trying to retain water in that top layer, just don't let it sink as far as it can go.
Yeah, I think that's some really important context to provide, because I know in the permaculture design course, when we have students come through, it's like they're so jazzed and they're ready to put swales in. People with every single soil type, every single context, they're like, okay, like how do I put this swale in? But it's really a testament to starting with that observation, reading the landscape, like what kind of opportunities is that landscape going to afford, and what are the pitfalls, along the way that you should avoid.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I am 100% for the attitude of just go do something. There's so many people that reach the end of a permaculture design course and then just they're in analysis paralysis and they're not going to do anything. So I think absolutely do something, but scale your actions effectively. What I really implore students to do is do a model first, whether it's the size of a tabletop or whether it's a small area. Build out what you want to do with a machine, just with a shovel, just by foot, simulate rainfall on it, understand how it behaves, how your soil materials behave, how big the spillways need to be. All of those kinds of variables you can learn immediately from that model without having to make a big mistake, essentially. So, do something so that you can start learning, but don't do everything before you know what you're doing.
Yeah.
Is this Shredder?
That's Shredder, yes.
This is Shredder the cat, Shredder the mouse slayer.
Spelled with a J. The J is silent. It's like Shredder.
What's the next question?
Top one right here.
Most earthworks seem to be about collecting water. What about production on a piece of property with a flat topography and a high water table? You probably just shouldn't let this.
Production, like agricultural production?
It doesn't say specifically. Let's assume agricultural production for now, and then we'll see if we can get some clarification in the chat from Kaylee.
Yeah, I would say one of the things that I hate most in the world is drain tile, which is basically draining the remaining wetlands that we have, which would be what you would usually do to a landscape like that to make it agriculturally productive. What can you do instead? Well, you could work with the ecological systems that used to be there, that used to produce a ton of food for indigenous peoples. You could work with the different species that like wet feet and can benefit from that ground table level. Now, in some situations, we might also engage in a thing where we're concentrating the wet and concentrating the dry. For example, in a swamp, you have this anaerobic soil that makes it hard to grow anything, but you don't have enough water to do aquatic systems. And so you can actually make earthworks where you dig into the water table to make more meaningful, productive water bodies. And in the process, you use that material to make more dry, arable land for crops, for fruit trees, for things of that nature. I would really implore you to not do drain tile as much as everyone's going to tell you you need to. And yes, for making that property produce corn, yeah, you probably need to, but you are directly feeding into the watershed death spiral by doing that.
Mm-hmm. We didn't get clarification from Kaylee on what sort of productivity there was there. I forgot to renew the Q&A. This is one from Patricia Wallace. Would looking at natural wet areas also help identify spots to create natural and connected ponds, in addition to how the trees grow?
Absolutely. And in plenty of cases, you're not going to have the trees to gauge off of or the vegetation to gauge off of. So that's one of the big things that, I think some of these more engineering heavy solutions are moving water around to different areas where it hasn't been previously. Sometimes that can make sense, particularly in like an Australian context where you have these long 2-year wet and dry periods. But what I think oftentimes achieves much better results is to do exactly what she's talking about there, to look for the areas that are naturally collecting water and enhance those areas. And that's how we can actually achieve the best results.
Mm-hmm. And Kim is asking, can you describe specifically some more of the stuff that you can learn from digging a land slice?
Yeah, so you can learn root penetration, quality of soil, consistency of soil, both for your topsoil and your subsoil layers. You're going to learn where different layers are that are carrying water, letting water permeate through, holding water up. You're going to see, potentially where a previous creek was that is sublimated into the ground, has gone underground. Mm-hmm. You're going to potentially find springs. You're going to potentially find how deep the water table is. It's going to be different things in different places. But even if we do a test slice and we find that we don't have any underground water flow, we don't have any clay, we don't have any impermeable layer, we don't have any of the things that we our want for building a water body, now we know that a water body is not the solution for that landscape. And we have a better understanding of how water is currently moving through that landscape based on the conditions of the test slice at the time of year that we're doing it. Additionally, you're also going to learn the time that you need to do the work. Earth works like this. There's a narrow window of time when those soils are at the prime humidity in order to work with. When soils are too wet, it's going to be a disaster. When soils are too dry, it's going to be a disaster. And so in that test slice process, I'm also saying, okay, it's March, and I can tell that this soil needs a couple more months to dry out before it's going to be workable. So June or July is the time to do this project, not in March. Or I might find, okay, the soil is already too dry in March, so we actually want to do it even earlier on when the soil is going to be more humid. So those are just some of the things you're going to start to understand from test slices.
Test slice is well worth it.
Absolutely.
Everything that you just listed there.
Could you give any sort of physical, descriptions of what the ideal soil condition would be for digging for those unfamiliar? Like how does that feel in your hands? What does it do to your senses?
Yeah, so the best thing to do is a ribbon test or a worm test, where you're essentially testing the elasticity of that material. The clay is what's going to hold that material together. As you press a ribbon between your fingers or you roll a worm between your hands, how long that material sticks together is going to tell you how much clay is in that material. Similarly, and especially while you're learning, you can do a mason jar test to determine the same things, where you can actually settle out the sand, silt, and clay in different layers within that mason jar and understand a little bit closer the percentages. And you're going to need, I think 40% is kind of a minimum. 60% is really safe. 50% is usually safe. In some soils, you might want a little bit higher clay portion. Once you get below 40%, you're really, maybe you have enough clay, but it depends on a lot of other factors. So that 40% and above clay composition is really the window that you're looking to work within. As you take and feel that material in your hands, you're going to feel the sand as you rub it between your fingers. And then you're going to notice the clay by pressing that ribbon and how long it sticks together. And then you're going to interpret the silt from those other two factors. If it didn't stick together at all, but I didn't feel any sand in it, that is almost an entirely silt soil. Now, it's also really important that is at the right moisture when you do those tests. Otherwise, it's not going to give you the correct results. And so it should be at the moisture where you can just barely, with all your might, squeeze one little drop of water out of that material. And it is worked to an even consistency, not that some of it's dry and some of it's too moist, but it's a nice balanced moisture at that consistency.
Gosh, I wish we taught this to children in school.
We should be.
Different our world would be.
One more question. We only got a couple more minutes here. This one's from TJ. And the question is, if building ponds high in the landscape is normally a poor idea, did the Kramerterhof, I totally mispronounced that, Sepp Holster's farm happen to have the right soils to make 70 ponds?
Yes, 100%. And not only that, but it is on a moorish mountain, which means higher on that landscape is these moors, these wetlands. So there's a lot of water moving through the ground there. So A, it had the right soil type, and B, it has lots of water moving through the ground. And only from those two together was he able to create those 72 connected water bodies.
Amazing. Cool. I mean, how fortuitous that he ended up right there.
I mean, a double-edged sword too, because it's hard to understand how high it is on the mountains until you're there and you're looking at a cross and seeing no one lives up here. This is all pine monoculture other than this one little patch on this side of the mountain with a few neighbors around it. Yes, but also it was an incredibly challenging project. And I think if Sepp was on a more an easier to cultivate landscape, what he would have achieved would have been even more insane.
Yeah. Yeah. But still to achieve what he did. And I've only seen videos. I've never been there, but it is so cool. And it's just a testament to like, you can do this in very hard places.
Yeah.
Everyone's always complaining that it's too hot, it's too cold, it's too wet, it's too dry. They are all advantages to be used when you really start to work with the natural processes.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm sure we could talk about that for at least 2 hours. But unfortunately, we're at time.
Zach,
Awesome. Thank you, guys.
Yeah.
This was a ton of fun. Really appreciate all the effort to put the conference together. Really appreciate you guys letting me hop up on my soapbox for an hour. It was a lot of fun.
We're really glad you did, and we really hope that we can get you back for future events or just future collaborations. I've learned a lot listening to you. I really enjoyed having you in the panel yesterday, and you're just doing some incredible work. Like it really is inspiring. So thank you so much, and keep doing you.
Likewise. Thank you, Ben and Mitch.
Thanks.
Appreciate you guys.